Welcome back, everybody. I hope you've had an opportunity to have a cup of coffee and you're ready to hear back on the product of all your excellent work yesterday. So we're now going to have a session reading back from the working groups yesterday. We're going to go through all 5 of those working groups, and then we are very fortunate to be hearing from Mr. Khaitan to respond to these, who's the Joint Secretary of the Ministry of Urban Development. We may have an opportunity for you to come in if there's something which is said by one of the speakers which is egregiously wrong and you totally disagree with it from your discussions yesterday. We have a little bit more time than we were expecting. Sadly, because Chief Minister Sheila Dixit is unfortunately unable to join us, she's unwell. So that's the bad news. The even worse news, perhaps, is that you will have us, perhaps, a slightly longer period of time. I'm going to turn first, if I may, to Serge Younes, who's the Director of Sustainability Services for Accenture in India, and he's going to talk about energy. You may have noticed over the course of the last 2 days that every once in a while the lights in here have dimmed somewhat surprisingly. That is an indication of the intermittency of electricity supply, even sometimes here in Delhi. I remember a statistic from yesterday where we were told that actually electricity supply was only available 4 to 5 hours a day on average across India. And of course, energy poverty in rural India is a dramatic problem. So Serge is going to talk about what his group discussed, but particularly the action points for government to take this forward. Serge.
Absolutely. Thank you, Charlie. It was a very pleasurable session, actually, working with my panelists, some of whom are still in the room today. We kind of had the challenge of looking at energy, and it's an extremely broad topic. So, we know the big numbers. We hear about the issues around access to energy, about energy generally here in India, but we also know the challenges globally. We know energy demand is going to double. Most of it is going to come from emerging and transitioning economies. And while the numbers seem quite scary, it is quite essential to know that you're getting the opportunity here to actually do something about it, and this is the right time, and today is the right forum to give the recommendations. And while the topic was very general, and we actually tend to agree a lot, when we got to the working tables, it came quite clear that there were 3 subtopics that we focused on while we were going through our working group. So we looked at access to energy, we looked at regulatory mechanisms and financial mechanisms to stimulate energy across all its forms, and finally looking at opportunities for leapfrogging in energy infrastructure and the supply for that. So I actually sat on the table that looked at access to energy. And we had a very interesting debate to start with. And that debate was on what is the definition for access to energy. Is it the standard model that we have here in India and generally across emerging economies of it's the potential of having availability of light? Or is it actually around the use of energy and how does that relate to people's livelihoods and ultimately the end use of that energy? And I think once we got through that, we cleared the way to start looking at recommendations. Now, recommendations seem to come mostly around what can government do, and then very quickly we moved on to what can businesses do, and how can the kind of collaborative and partnership model actually influence government to actually enable things. So the first recommendation, Charlie, came out as there was some severe gap on the policy level. There's some fantastic policies, especially here in India, at central level, but those are often lacking in their implementation once you get to state level and to local level, and people are suffering from that. So one clear recommendation is to be enabling to draw down on that local level and address those issues. Secondly, it came very apparent that there's a flurry of entrepreneurship in the energy sector, especially in the clean energy sector. One of my panelists actually reminded me and reminded the work group that within a lot of the colonies, even here in Delhi, what happens is there are cooperatives that come up to actually look at diesel generators to provide that lack of power. And actually, what is not happening is creating an infrastructure and an enabling regulation potentially to help those organizations to go down the green path. So the second recommendation that we have, Charlie, is how can we help those businesses, those entrepreneurs, to green the supply chain for clean tech and clean energy, and effectively stimulating the market on that. Now, jumping onto our second subtopic, which is around regulatory stability and financial mechanisms, what seems to come up recurrently on the table is there is a requirement for minimum standards. Now, there are minimum standards for white goods. There are minimum standards for buildings coming up. However, what is missing is that although there's a lot of new coming up here in India and in developing economies, there's a massive amount of old stock that needed to be tackled. So the recommendation here that came up is, could we start looking at how we can enable businesses who are selling the latest standards of air conditioning or kind of roof fans to create a new business model, working with government, working with utilities to change things on the kind of demand side rather than on the supply side. So that was one of the critical items that came out on the regulatory fronts. On the financial mechanisms, I think what was coming up is there's not enough support on the small-scale renewables and small-scale energy efficiency programs, and that was really missed and really needed here in India. And I think from our experience as panelists on the energy group, we kind of agreed that that was the case pretty much globally in emerging economies. So this is a lesson that we can transmit globally as well. Now, on the energy infrastructure side, we keep hearing that there is a lack of infrastructure, but there is an opportunity for infrastructure. So we had a good conversation as panelists around cities, and that was coming up a lot, and actually around smart grids. So one recommendation was, could regulation be changed to encompass some of the latest technologies that is emerging around smart grids, around smart metering, so that they are better implemented across the country, but looking at the opportunity that those will provide in terms of better implementing small-scale renewables and potentially, again, linking up to the financial mechanisms for small-scale systems, and then looking at the impact of empowering people to actually know what they are consuming and hence changing kind of their behaviors effectively. So that was one of the kind of key things from energy infrastructure. I think we then tackled some of the large infrastructures and started looking at the mechanisms that are required for big plant operators and manufacturers on the ability to better integrate them in terms of forecasting when they're going to be connecting, around looking at how we can better improve the kind of supply and demand side kind of convergence here in India. But ultimately, across all those three conversations, what came up is it always went beyond energy. And then suddenly what we ended up across the tables is we got into a conversation around resource and resource efficiency and resource demand and resource supply. And this is something that transcends beyond energy. I'm looking at the rest of my panelists today to be talking about how they heard about energy and the nexus with their relevant topics.
Absolutely, and that's a conversation we'll hope to have a little bit later. I mean, just to take one example, connecting to water, of course, very often if water needs to be pumped, that's a tremendously high electricity cost. So these things are very much interrelated. But first, if we could turn to Stefan Helming, who's the country director of GIZ in India, and who chaired the waste group. Stefan.
Yes, thank you very much, Charlie. Good afternoon. We also had a very nice discussion on the topic of waste. The panel was like this, all male, but the discussion still was quite good. We started discussing a radical proposition by removing the term waste from the English language, because what is waste to one person thrown away is a resource to the other. So waste is not waste, waste is a resource. And that seemed to be the fundamental idea that went through all our deliberations. Waste management, we found, also has to do with the fabric, the very fabric of a society. There's a cultural dimension. People who manage waste are, in many places, considered socially inferior, and there's a mindset story. We find that villages are clean, but cities are not. There must be a reason for that, which has to do not only with technologies and governance, but also with the way people behave around waste. Right, if I say waste is a resource, it of course means reducing, reusing, recycling. These are all the various forms of waste management: reducing, reusing, recycling. Almost everything, or let's say everything, can be used so that in the end no waste is left. The fly ashes can be used for construction. The cement industry is ready to co-process, as the term is, toxic waste, all kinds of dirty things that can be very safely burnt in the cement industry and treated that way. And it's a resource again. So we have found many business initiatives, and that was quite impressive in our panel of people in India who are now using various types of waste and various processes related to what other people consider waste, for them a resource, and make a viable business proposition out of that. Of course, a lot of that is informal sector and has always been, and a recommendation would be to look to more and more regularize that and transfer it to the more formal environment. We have ourselves worked a lot on e-waste, which is a very dirty and dangerous thing when it's treated in the slums, but it's a very good business proposition to recover all the valuable materials in our computer parts and mobiles. When it comes to recommendations, obviously, very similar to energy, economics, pricing, give incentives need to be put properly to increase the use of this resource, which we call waste. Applying the polluter pays principle, not only for wastewater, also for solid waste, and there must also be penalties. All that will create an environment for business. I think this conference is business for environment, but that's an environment for business. Of course, using waste and reusing waste, considering waste as a resource, is only possible if the various components or fractions of waste are not all mixed together. Because you use them separately. So the question comes up, segregation of waste, is that something that should happen at source, as we do it in Germany, or should it happen later on in different processes? We couldn't agree on that, and there probably isn't a solution that fits any size. Every country is different and every environment is also different. But segregating waste and trying to avoid everything being mixed together definitely makes use, of course, obviously, much easier and also more economic. Governance, when we come to recommendations, governance is extremely important. When we look at India, it's a municipal level, which is where lack of expertise, lack of sometimes heritage, lack of good systems is a problem. So again, I think you were saying that policies seem to be in place, policies are in place, but implementation is lacking, especially at the municipal and the level of urban local bodies. One other proposition that came up was to use nature, to treat nature as an entity, give it a voice, because it doesn't have a voice by itself, but it is a legitimate stakeholder. And then coming again to the energy nexus here, we had a heated debate about incineration of waste, because if you have plastic and you reuse it, recycle it several times, in the end it's probably a good idea to burn it and recover the energy content. But to burn and incinerate municipal waste, which with a huge organic content of 70% or so, doesn't make sense. So somewhere in between the truth lies, but it's a heated debate about this heat generation from energy that we couldn't finish. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you very much indeed, Stefan. And of course, I mean, we should remember that we had heard earlier from companies, enterprises, entrepreneurs who are operating in this area who are, of course, turning waste to resource, waste ventures, etc. But also, I note something that occurred in both your intervention and in Serge's intervention, which is the problems at the local level, the municipal government level. We shouldn't assume that everything can be sorted out at the national government level. very much. And indeed, one should then ask the question, well, can we truly expect municipal governments at all to be able to solve this, or is it going to be much more of a community-based solutions that we should be looking for? I'm now going to turn to Mahesh Rao, who's the country lead for Ecolab in India, and he will be talking about water, which of course touches on all of these, and it touches on health. It's very political, it's necessary for agriculture, necessary for industry. At Chatham House, I have a map of the world which color codes the most water-stressed parts of the world. I'm sure it's a map which everyone on this panel is very familiar with. Well, India is very noticeable because it's virtually all bright red, i.e. highly water-stressed. So this is a pressing issue now, of course. So, Mahesh, what recommendations do we have to deal with it?
Thanks, Charles, and good afternoon to my fellow panelists, and a very good afternoon to all our friends here, those who want to make a difference, certainly. Water is a very topical issue because it affects us all. Every day it affects our families, and so it has a lot of high focus, not just at the global level, but also at a local level. I have to thank my fellow panelists from yesterday. We had a very good session, a lot of great input, as well as the participants of the workshop helped us drive a lot of healthy and active debate. As Charles pointed out, referred to the map, water is a global phenomenon, and the scarcity of it is becoming a concern to all and sundry. Essentially, the main difference between water and global warming is the fact that the whole carbon issue and the whole greenhouse gas issue is more on an international scale. But water issues tend to be highly local. And that's where it takes a lot of participation at a local level to address the issues around water. And India is particularly in the water-stressed category, and what this actually means is when water usage or water availability drops to less than 1,700 cubic meters per person per annum, that's when it's classified as water-stressed. In addition, the demand exceeds more than 40% of the national resource or the reserves in that particular country. So both of these clubbed together then qualifies a country to be water-stressed. And India is certainly in that class, along with Cambodia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, a few of the countries in our own zone. So in the whole debate, one of the things that we did was we actually went through the as-is situation. What are we faced with in India in particular at this point in time? And then it went on to what can we do about it. So essentially, when you look at the water usage in India, 89 to 90% of our water is used for agriculture. It's only 10 to 11% that's used for domestic use and for industry. So we felt that the focus should be more on conserving and improving the usage of water for agriculture. And of course, there is a lot of impact that can come from industrial initiatives to minimize the usage of water as well as domestic. But we felt that the focus should be on the major water user, which is the agricultural sector. So, we spoke about water reduction through drip irrigation, for example. We talked about the development of, drought-resistant crops, maybe some investment in generating some sort of innovation around crops that need less water. There was an example which one of the panelists yesterday gave where they were looking at paddy being grown on non-lagooned type farmland. As everyone knows, paddy is grown on a lot of water. They were actually looking at dry farming of paddy, and they have been successful in several areas of India in their ability to do that. So it's innovation like that, it's techniques like that, it's investment into areas like that that is certainly going to make a major impact on our overall water use. In India, a lot of our water, we depend on our water from rainfall as well as our snow melt. And the problem is we do get a lot of rainfall in several areas of India, but it's for a short span of time. Could be a few months, could be a few weeks. It's the catchment, it's the collection, it's the distribution of that water that becomes a problem. Because a lot of this water eventually runs into rivers and ends up in the oceans and the seas. So we are unable to contain the water that lands on the Indian soil. I think some of the speakers yesterday talked about 16% of the world's population living in India on 2.5% of the landmass. So, and we only have 4% of the world's water reserves in this country. So we are water stressed and water stretched. We certainly need to make an impact on how this water is used. We all know that industry is doing a significant bit towards minimizing water usage. There's a lot of recycle, reuse, and reduce initiatives through major industries. And what is driving this is, again, global knowledge. A lot of these companies are multinational companies, and they tend to adopt global best practice in terms of water usage. And you'll hear from many industries that they're trying to adopt the least water usage per manufactured unit. Urban water quality has dropped significantly, and I think Charles pointed out it's not just a question of availability, it's a question of hygiene and health as well. So water not only has to be made available, but water quality has to be addressed. People in India are pretty much left to their own devices sometimes. They dig their own bore wells, they try and acquire water by whatever means they can, and this sometimes leads to the breakdown of infrastructure and a breakdown in the overall management of our water resources. And of course, bore wells, as you dig more and more and get deeper and deeper, they tend to deplete our valuable aquifers. And once you start to do that, this could lead to significant drought conditions in the country affecting our very own crops. So in saying all that, we came up with a list of recommendations as to what we should be looking at doing and who plays what roles and responsibilities in the overall management of this very valuable resource. So what we looked at is we recommended the creation and the promotion of a legal framework that allows equal acceptance of risks between both public and private sectors. We also talked about adapting targets for public funding, which are in line with the ground realities. Because when you look at public funding for water resources and water infrastructure in a country like India, it is quite small compared to countries like Singapore and China and, of course, other developed nations. So I think in the face of crisis, the public funding has to be more in line with the ground realities. And of course, going beyond ideological debates as to, private participation, etc., but focusing more on education. I believe water conservation starts with education at the farmer level, at the municipal and rural level, as well as the community level. I know in countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, etc., they have programs, even in schools, at the school level, they are starting to sensitize children to the conservation of water. Among other things as well, there is management of waste, there is management of power. So people tend to get more and more conscious on how we can utilize these very valuable but depleting resources. And of course, we talked a little bit about the usage of power in the transportation of water. It's pretty expensive to transport water using pumps and so on. So there's a whole debate of power that comes in. And when you talk about waste, water is also a waste stream, or can be a waste stream. And that's one of the areas where we need to manage our water waste more efficiently and effectively. We also talked about setting tariffs. I know this is an area where a lot of people's backs get up having to pay for water, which is a basic necessity for humanity. We all believe that we have a right to water, we have a right to clean and safe water, but then people must also understand when the government is managing water infrastructure, water resources, the whole operation and maintenance, and also building new infrastructure, there is a cost involved that has to be borne by the end user as well. So some sort of an equitable tariff system which assures a basic amount of water for free for all, but then also a tariff over and above that to support the system and to sustain it for the future. The other areas we talked about is the use of technology. There is a lot of technology out there that can enable us to measure, to report, to manage water more efficiently. A few of the people in the panelists yesterday talked about agricultural tools where you can put tensiometers into the soil that tells you exactly when you need to irrigate the plants, no more and no less. So that is efficient use of water in the farming sector. And there are tools that can actually remotely monitor this sort of telemetry and enable farmers to have water to their crops in a just-in-time fashion. Also, sorry, Charles.
I might stop you there because I want to make sure that we're all able to go around, although particularly on the point of water pricing, which of course is highly political, clearly that message somehow got out of the room, circulated around Delhi, because Sheila Dixit, who I didn't think was going to be able to make it, is able to make it.
Oh, fantastic.
So she will be here shortly. But let me just, I'm sure we can come back to these issues a little bit later in the discussion. But I wanted to move on, if I may, to Peter Graham, who's the Executive Director of the Global Buildings Performance Network. One thing which I think we've all agreed today and yesterday is that one thing India will be doing a lot of in the next decades is building. So how do we build right? How do we urbanize right? How do we not follow the Western model? Peter.
Well, I wish I could say we had answers to all of those questions out of the session yesterday.
Well, just 9 out of 10.
Well, okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and it's great to be here, and thanks also to our panel yesterday for a very, very lively debate. We set ourselves the aim of thinking about measures we could take to scale up innovation for building sustainably. And we really wanted to replace this idea of sustainable building as the definition of the problem with the definition of how do we innovate the building sector so that we can have more sustainable outcomes. If we shift that emphasis from sustainability to innovation, we incorporate and include business strategy far more centrally. So that was really where we were coming from. The context of our discussion was really around two main priorities. One, the urgency of dealing with climate change and water scarcity, reflecting on the fact that the building sector is a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and that on the latest analysis, we're not on a trajectory to meet our 2 degrees C global warming target and avoid the worst case scenarios of climate change. We must address these issues as rapidly as possible. So scale up meant speed up, and scale also meant which scale is the right scale to take action. Is it at the individual building level, or is it at a community scale? And then from an organisational perspective, at what scale should we be focusing our attention? Is it at the top end of town, or is it at the small to medium enterprises, or both, and at what level? So that was the basic context. We had a very lively debate around a number of specific issues, so I've taken some license to organise the key points from our debate into some strategies. There are 3 main categories of recommendations. The first deals with regulations and performance goals. There is a need for regulation in the building sector to generate a mainstream shift and deliver performance. But in emerging economies, and not specifically India, but India is an example, there is really a lack of regulation of the performance of buildings, particularly the environmental impact of buildings, even in issues which we're quite used to dealing with, such as energy. It's very patchy when we look at the regulatory frameworks. So there is definitely a need for regulation. And there's a need for performance goal setting. If we take an incremental approach to improving building performance, we're never going to reach the sort of speed of change that we need to make an environmental and social difference. So the first recommendation in this category is to develop simple life cycle performance regulations and guidelines for urban residential housing. One of the other key issues that came up to set the context for our workshop was this unmet growing demand for affordable and sustainable housing. Now, affordability and sustainability shouldn't be mutually exclusive, and a house is a human right, and a sustainable house should be a human right as well. It shouldn't be treated as a luxury good. So we need to deal with that at the level of regulation. But they need to be simple to develop and simple to implement. I offer that the first priority should be around regulations on energy and thermal comfort, because our analysis, the GBPN's analysis, shows that in India, just as an example, with unregulated energy consumption for thermal comfort in the huge growing multifamily urban residential market, you'll see a growth in energy demand from housing of between 400 and 700% by 2050. And that certainly is unsustainable. Second, so there are frameworks, the NAMA frameworks, National Agreed Mitigation Actions, and the Low Energy Development frameworks are interesting frameworks to think about as a venue for action there. The second recommendation is around collaboration with industry to develop integrated policies and business models for sustainable and affordable housing at the community scale and focusing on small to medium enterprises. There was some very interesting inputs offered around models for delivering more sustainable low-cost housing using networks of social entrepreneurs. So one tangible action could be to create a network of social entrepreneurs, building professionals, developers and financiers, and together with government share and improve business models for providing sustainable, affordable housing and implementing regulations that control the quality. The third recommendation is to work through venues such as the Major Economies Forum and Sustainable Energy for All to set absolute reduction goals for energy use in new buildings. We know that one of the primary actions we can take to get back onto a 2-degree trajectory is to make sure that new buildings are as close to net zero energy as possible, if not positive energy. And we had a discussion around enabling technologies, and it appears that we do have the technologies to achieve that goal. So using some of the multilateral frameworks to help provide supporting funding to develop business models that could deliver that are very important. Once you get the goals set, then we already have the infrastructure within the civil society and the international community to provide roadmaps and capacity building and so forth. Next category of issue is really around financing and incentives to improve the access to transformative building technologies and materials. So there's quite a heated debate about various aspects of materials and ranging from we should be banning glass buildings to we should be enforcing that all lights are LED. So without being too specific and absolute, I thought that a tangible recommendation might be to create a chamber of commerce to stimulate the market for transformative technologies such as LEDs, PV panels, low-emission concrete, prefabrication, etc., into emerging markets to really start to look at what the barriers are to the free flow of transformative technologies to the building sector and to overcome the barriers. The last area of issue that we focused on was around data sharing and learning. We pay very little attention to the way our building stock performs. Even with great energy and green labelling schemes and so forth, the amount of attention paid to the actual performance of buildings after they're constructed is very low, and the systematic collection of quality data around the performance of buildings is also patchy. And we don't go back and analyse our policies to see whether they're working very well, very often, and so on. So there's a real gap, and we can't really learn our way out of this unsustainable pattern unless we start to systematically collect data. So a couple of recommendations drawn from our discussions yesterday. One is to create, to sort of promote a culture around performance measurement and evaluation, perhaps creating an initiative for universities, governments and NGOs to come together to kind of map where the data sets already are, to generate and share building performance data systematically, and use open linked data platforms. There's a number of big databases now in the world which are collecting and sharing openly building performance data. And if we can link those together, then we can build apps and tools for analysis that can be put in the hands of business decision makers and government and policy decision makers to sort of speed up the rate of change. Coming to the issue of education, one of the common areas that came out of the workshop was the need for a kind of education revolution in the building sector. That, we're by and large teaching our building professionals to replicate unsustainable forms of building design and urban development. Where is our education for sustainable built environments? So one tangible action that could be taken would be for government, civil society and industry to adopt the UN Environment Programme's guidelines on education policy for sustainable built environments as a framework for a campaign to reform building sector education from university level through to skilled and unskilled labour. That particular framework also includes informal education as well as formal education. As far as I'm aware, it hasn't yet been developed into a strategy. So I think that's an opportunity that could help organise action on education for sustainable buildings. So that is it in a nutshell. I know we're probably pressing for time.
No,
but,
that's...
there you go.
Well, Peter, that's great, and I think we'll come back to some of that. There are two questions there that I have particular, which I don't want you to answer now, but one is, where do we have good examples at scale of the kind of housing you're talking about? Not one house, but villages, towns, cities. And the second is actually, a very big idea which came up yesterday was how India is urbanizing. India has an opportunity to urbanize in a different way. It's not just about the buildings, but also about the cities and the structure of cities. And I'd be interested to know whether that was discussed or not. And of course, that connects very nicely to the question of transport and mobility, which Martin was dealing with. So, Martin, I turn it without further ado over to you.
Thanks very much. We had a very lively group, Compact and Bijou group. In fact, it was very hard to shut them up. They really got into the discussion. And they came up with really 3 broad recommendations. The first one was bearing in mind the fact that the majority of Indians later this century are probably going to be living in cities that haven't yet been built. There's a tremendous opportunity for designing new communities around sustainability, and particularly around sustainable mobility. So there was a sense that this emerging network of satellite towns needs to have sustainable mobility at its heart. As one panelist rather acidly commented, they'd like to see the towns designed to suit the needs of the people and businesses who are going to live there, rather than just the real estate developers and their political friends. People were keen to see the size of new cities optimized, not just to allow endless urban sprawl. Somebody said, don't do everything on a Delhi/Mumbai scale. Don't assume that we're automatically replicating the current patterns of urban development. Build rail, rapid bus transit, and other public transport services in from the start, and then design the homes, the residential areas, the businesses and industrial areas around them. So you have a skeleton of good public transport services there to start with, and you design a community around them. Somebody suggested we should even consider car-free towns for small communities, or at the least towns that actively favor walking and cycling. And it was pointed out that the idea of a car-free town, a car-free community, might sound anathema to India, but it's been tried in California, which is a state which loves its cars, and there the property values in those communities are about 20% higher than in conventional ones. So when you actually build something where people can see what it's like, am I still on the mic? Yeah. You can see what it's like to live without cars rushing by all the time. They like it. They like it so much they're prepared to pay premium prices for it. We talked a bit about the issue of deliveries, of moving stuff around, and there was a case made for designing cities, either existing ones or planned ones, so that they have delivery hubs round the outskirts, so there's no need for major trucks to go through the center of cities. You can have small, probably electric-powered vehicles doing little shuttle deliveries from these hubs to people's homes and businesses within the city. And the final point within this designing communities for sustainability was that classic question of integrating transport, particularly integrating the transport infrastructure around the key nodes which people regularly use. So in other words, working out where the flows of people are, where the flow is at its greatest, and making sure you've got a good integration of different transport methods around those. Somebody pointed out India is not short of roads. In terms of road kilometers per area, it's got twice as many roads as the United States. It's just a few of the roads are heavily congested, a lot of the roads are hardly used at all. Make sure you have links between places where people want to go, even if they're not historically places that people wanted to travel between. Again, someone pointed out there's no, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what I noted down, there's no direct transit link, metro link between Gurgaon and Noida. So people have to go into Delhi and out again. So design transport links around where people want to go. The second of the 3 recommendations was around incentives. Incentivize good behavior. Encourage people to do the right thing rather than try to get around rules that they find inconvenient. Somebody commented, Indians are innovative. If you give us the right incentives, we'll find a way. So specific ideas for that. These are not unfamiliar, I'm sure, to most of you. Tax breaks for green technology. Rewards for using public transport over private cars. And a strong sense that city authorities should do their part by actively promoting more sustainable transport. So, for example, by procuring electric vehicles, giving their employees free train or bus passes for a week or a month to make green transport choices more acceptable, so that people begin to see going by public transport as something which normal, well-off people do, rather than the recourse of those who aren't so well off. And somebody said no one takes a city bureaucrat seriously if she encourages people to use public transport but then arrives at work in her chauffeur-driven car every day. So there was that sense of the need to actively promote green travel choices as desirable, as socially responsible, as high status. There's a sense, for example, take something like cycling. In London, 40, 50 years ago, cycling was the preserve of the poor. Now in London, the rich cycle. And if you think it's easy cycling in London, you should try cycling in London through our rainy winters. But it's become something which is associated with a degree of status. So certain sort of preconceptions of what types of transport are acceptable or not can be shifted. Then there was a sense of, or an idea for drawing up a livable city index. Get cities to compete to be seen as the most sustainable, the most desirable place to live in the country. And you could even institutionalize it so that a proportion of government support funding for infrastructure was awarded depending on how high up the list, how high up the index a particular city had come. So create a sense of competition between cities to be the most livable place. And then finally, the third of the 3 recommendations, having said all that about incentives, there was still a sense that on occasion we need to wield a regulatory stick to back it up. And we had a few points on this. One was suggesting enforcing traffic rules to encourage safer, more sustainable driving. On the whole, unsafe driving is less sustainable driving. You're consuming more fuel, etc. And somebody said have a centralized national database of offenders, so it's harder to get away with it. And have a few high-profile prosecutions of high-level offenders. That might send the right signal out. There was some talk about demand-side management. Maybe because it was quite late in the day, people started getting quite radical around this one. And one of our 2 groups proposed limiting the number of cars permitted per household. One little sort of faction even suggesting having a maximum of 1 car per household. That would be quite draconian, but then there were other ideas around could you have incentives, fiscal incentives, to encourage people not to have an unnecessary number of cars per household. Consider stipulating the proportion of new developments should be car-free developments, or should be ones that provide specifically for walking and cycling in large measure. And then finally, as somebody pointed out, you cannot have a situation, you cannot have a sustainable transport situation where half the population is wary of using public transport because they fear being harassed, they fear being attacked. So there was a strong message about if you want to get people using public transport, make buses and metros safe for women. Thank you.
Martin, that's excellent. I'm pleased to report that I cycle in London, and I'm very pleased to have my status thereby confirmed. Interested to hear about the notion that China had a one-child policy, maybe India can have a one-car policy. I want to ask you one very brief question, then turn over to Mr. Khaitan, which is to ask about the provision of public transport. And we use the term public transport, but could we not also say mass transit? I mean, what's the role for the private sector in public transport? Is that something which came up? Is that something which was discussed? Or was public transport very much viewed as a government or municipal responsibility?
Well, it's interesting if you look at Ahmedabad, where you've got the bus rapid transit system in Ahmedabad, which is very much, as I understand it, I was writing about this last year and my memory's dried up a bit, but I understand it's a public-private arrangement. I'm right in saying that, in Ahmedabad? Yep. And that seems to have been very successful, as far as I know. certainly having been there and seen it myself, the difference between what you see in Ahmedabad and what you see in much of the rest of the country is really quite striking. So there, government setting the framework, businesses exploiting that framework to the full seems to be a way forward.
Also, I should add, I'm very sorry to leave you on tenterhooks on this one, but the Chief Minister of Delhi is in fact not coming. In fact, it was simply her security detail who wanted to conduct a security sweep of the room, and that got us very excited, but sadly, she's not. Anyway, but the good news is that we have Mr. Khaitan, who is able to carry this message forward to her, and indeed much further. But perhaps first, if you'd respond to what you've heard today, does it resonate with you? Do you have comments on it?
Thank you, Charles. First of all, I thank all the panelists who have put their experience behind all these recommendations, and to all those participants who brainstormed yesterday on the complex issues of urban development. My opinion is that when you convert your concerns into business, only then you can put your professionalism into it. Only then you can put your energy for making the policy, and only then you can make long-term strategy to provide all these things. The problem with government is that the whole complex issues like water, public transport, waste, energy is put up to government, and government is given few minutes to either provide some policy framework solutions or to find some solutions for that. But at the same time, since the brainstorming took place in the context of India and Asia specifically, and it was discussed what are the policy frameworks which are already existing in India in these sectors. So it will be very useful for us when we get all these recommendations to review that what is already existing, what are the expectations from industry or service providers. Let me say a few points regarding first the water and waste. One has to understand that water and waste are not only the sectors which requires technology or other things. Very deep sociological aspects are entrenched into this sector. As was mentioned that the use of water or management of waste is community-based. So there are sociological aspects to it. Everyone has to keep in mind that it cannot be dealt only with technology or innovation or other things. For example, in 2005, government launched Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Renewal Mission. And there were few reforms which were attached to development of infrastructure in these two sectors. One of the reform was that the user charges for these utilities. And it was very difficult to convince state governments, to convince local bodies that the user charges, increasing user charges is necessity for making it a long-term availability. Most of the states, they were hesitant on some or other pretext, and in some of the states it was taken up and it reached to the level, but still in most of the local bodies, even the operation and maintenance cost was not being met through these user charges. When he was talking about, Mr. Mahesh was talking about the fair pricing of water. What is fair? In a very complex society like India, where there is a big gap between rich and poor, and when everyone is talking about the cross-subsidization, what is fair? So it was very difficult to decide, and it was left to the state and urban local bodies. And some of the states are coming up with some of the solutions, but still there is a long gap which needs to be fulfilled. But in both water sector and waste sector, there are many policies in place. It is the question of the weak management. And when we talk about these two sectors, three things which come up to the mind. One is that how we define the consumer, the end user, or the community. And second is providing infrastructure for these two sectors. And I think that is the concern of the industry, which is sitting here and deliberating upon this. And the third is regulation. A lot of policy framework has gone into it in the last decade or so. And now it is very open. The only problem which we are facing is that water is supposed to be owned by the community. So there is a lot of resistance when the water sector is given to manage to the private sector. So the general sociological perception is that it is owned by the community. And whenever any private sector comes into picture for management of it, then there is a lot of hue and cry, and there are a lot of resistance on that part. But the main thing which came from this discussion was that the maximum water, almost 80–85%, is used by the agriculture sector. And in my opinion, 10 to 15%, which is used by industry or domestic sector, is a very small quantity. And unless we frame some parameters for use of water in agriculture sector, we cannot enhance the quantity which should be available for domestic use or for industrial use. And for that, we have to make many sociological changes, many policy framework changes, and then we have to educate society that water is a very precious commodity. Regarding energy, as he rightly said, that there was a lot of debate about what is the meaning of access to energy. Because some of the states are following a policy that if energy has reached to the house where only 2 bulbs can be lit, they consider that there is 100% access to the energy. It is basically the quality of, it is basically the use of energy for improvement in quality and livelihood, as rightly pointed out. That should be the parameter for access to the energy. The second thing is that he mentioned about that there is a very good policy at central level for energy generation, but the link missing is at state level. That is not true. That is not true because of two things. One is that some of the states have framed very good policy in energy sector as well. The main variation and the variation in response of the state government is because of two reasons. There is a regional variation in generation of energy. Some of the states have all the resources to generate a lot of energy, and some of the states do not have much resources to generate energy. The second thing is that transmission and distribution lines are not adequate. And there is a regional variation in that also. So because of the regional variation, both in generation and distribution, the state government response cannot be uniform, even when we issue guidelines from central government, which are very progressive, but it cannot be the same. So one has to look state-specific problems, and only then we can say that the missing link of state policy, whether it's there or not. The issue of sustainability of the building. First thing is that whenever we talk of sustainable building, we focus only on 2–3 things. One is energy consumption, and then water consumption, and we did not much emphasize about the type of material which is being used for construction of the building. For example, still even today, whenever any environment impact assessment is done for the real estate, there is no provision of public scoping in this. And I think most of the real estate developers will not like it that whenever there is an environment impact assessment being prepared, there should be public scoping. What happens? What is the result of that? There are 2-3 things which is happening in this sector. One is that there are few norms for green building. There are few parameters decided by LEED. There are few parameters decided by GRIHA norms developed by Terry. And then we have developed a system of star rating for green building. What is happening? That most of the government buildings are trying to adopt it through different codes. But I doubt that the same thing is being done by the private developers. And as you are aware, that unless the real estate developers, private developers, honestly try to adopt some of the norms of the green building, which might be costly, which might require bringing technology from other countries, which might require putting a lot of effort, but unless they adopt it, it is very difficult for government to force something and tell private developer that unless you make this kind of building, we are not going to give permission. I'm sure about one thing, that government should try to put some incentive for the green buildings, for sustainable buildings, which is right now not there. But at the same time, when you are trying to develop sustainable building, you yourself are gaining something, not only the developer, but the consumer, and at the end, society is gaining something. So if you calculate all those gains, I think this is the right time for private developers to think over it, that whatever technology they have to bring, maybe whatever finance they have to bring, but they should try to bring use material and try to develop green buildings. I will not discuss about the affordability and sustainability, because as he said that it cannot be exclusive. But at the same time, depending on the type of demand which is there in India, it is very difficult for urban local bodies or state governments to make it inclusive, affordability and sustainability. Transport sector is very interesting, and many examples have been given from the developed countries, like restricting the use of motorized vehicles. Unless you have a network of public transport, it is very difficult to develop a concept like this, because you have to have a very good public transport network. Only then you can think of like this. The second thing which he pointed out is the integrated transport planning, which is happening in India now, especially in the last decade, when the metro was being developed in Delhi, when it was started in Delhi. And now, as you are aware, that there are many cities which are having metro. And those who live in Delhi now can understand that how convenient it has become to travel through metro. And earlier there was only bus, and that also not a concept of BRTS. It was called DTC bus. And when I was a student here in University of Delhi, then we used to ride that DTC bus, and that was the only available public transport in Delhi. But now the scenario has totally changed. And our experience in public transport is that mostly it depends on the response of the state government and urban local body. For example, if you think of public transport or metro around Delhi, government of Haryana is much more responsive to the demand of the consumers for public transport. So you will find that connectivity to Gurgaon is increasing. But at the same time, the response of government of UP is not very encouraging. So the connectivity to Noida is still a question mark. So our experience is that we are there to support in the form of equity, in the form of grant, but it is basically state-specific and city-centric. So the response of state government or urban local body has to be there. Only then maybe we can come up with something which helps public, and integration of public transport is there. He raised the question of cycling, and I think that there is a great need of educating society for this. He gave example of London. I saw last year how cycling is being promoted in Paris. So, you have parking areas for cycles, and you can pick up a cycle from anywhere and leave it to anywhere. There are parking areas for cycle. So, and that has come up in last 5 years or so. So there is a great need of educating society for this. At the same time, developing some infrastructure for this purpose, because unless there are cycle tracks, it is not possible to do cycling, because it will become very dangerous. And as all of you are aware, that the Netherlands has a sociological habit of doing cycling. So in Europe, I think Netherlands is the best example for cycling. So that way, we have to integrate many other things in public transport, and then only we can solve the problems of transport and mobility. Charles, I think I have covered all the sectors.
Yes, okay. Great. Thank you.
But only one thing I would like to request, that since this is being held for the first time in India, and there might be very good points which came up during the discussion yesterday. So it will be very useful for us if we get a detailed report in this regard. And since our ministry is not the only ministry which concerns this, so we will try to coordinate and send these things to different ministries. At the same time, I think the champions of industry are here, so they can also do the follow-up. But as Urban Development Ministry, it is our duty to coordinate all these sectors, because these are the complex issues, and these all concern urban development. So it will be very useful if you could send the detailed report to us, and then maybe we will have a brainstorming session in our ministry, and we'll try to coordinate with other ministries.
Excellent. I just want to make two very brief comments, and I want to turn it over to you incredibly briefly, because we're now eating into lunchtime. I suppose the point I want to make is one doesn't always have to look to government for everything. You know, we live in well, I don't live in India, but many people here live in a society which is tremendously rich in terms of civil society, it's tremendously rich in terms of entrepreneurialism. But what government clearly can do is set frameworks. It can clearly affect the political economy of a lot of these areas of water, energy, which are very fraught, very difficult, subsidies, tremendous problem. It can set policy frameworks which really can enable all this. And I believe from everything I've heard today and yesterday, there is a real opportunity to do things differently, that things are being done differently, and that's a tremendously positive development going forward. There is a possibility to set social norms, development norms here, which will be different from elsewhere, which will stand India in very good stead in the future. We have virtually no time, in fact, minus time. So I simply want to ask people on the panel if there is one big idea, and I mean really one big idea, which they can put into 15 seconds, which they want to share, which has come out of this conversation or before, then please share it now or forever hold your peace. Are there big ideas on this panel?
I'd like to say one thing.
Yes.
It's not a crystallized, beautiful idea, but I've heard a lot about this idea of a Western versus Eastern distinction, and that we need to abandon the ways of the West and follow the ways of the East. I'd say this is, to me, from a building perspective, is a false distinction. That if you look across the world, there are good things happening in all regions, and the bad things we can learn from. And so I'd encourage that thought about collaboration, of being open about the mistakes as well as the successes. And you know, if you just look at action in the building sector, we can see that China and India are not on track for meeting climate goals. Europe is, but US is not either.
Yeah, but Europe is for different reasons. But we can certainly learn from the bad and develop the good. Are there other big ideas? Yes,
Charlie, I think that there's a thought that I'd like the panelists to think about and the floor today, which is the forecast for how much infrastructure is required around the globe over the next couple of years is an astronomical number, but it's already committed. You know, it's in the hundreds of trillions. You know, we were in Davos a couple of months ago, and we learned that what we need for green growth is only 14 billion, right? It's a tiny amount across a large pool of committed money. What we need as businesses is that for government to provide the foundation to let us innovate, and then for also to provide the foundation for private finance to come in. I was speaking with panelists and people yesterday at the reception, and they were saying, there is a lot of money out there. We just don't know where to put it.
Okay, so it's about getting this compass arrow, which is now pointing north-northwest, getting it to point true north. Martin.
I'd echo those points, and just particularly the point about the opportunities in countries such as India to get it right. The West has been getting it wrong in terms of urban planning for 100 years. But because there are so many new developments coming up in India, there's the opportunity to get it right first time, which is a wonderful one to be seized.
Stefan.
Another one which the West has got wrong is this link between water and waste is wastewater and sanitation, which wasn't mentioned. Now, the West has invented the flushing toilet, which uses like a third or half of all the fresh, clean water to flush away feces. Is that a sustainable method? Who is going to pay for all the wastewater treatment of clean water that is used not for feeding people, but as a means of transport? Okay. Where's that going to lead?
Mahesh.
I'd just like to say that I think the management of water and the usage of water should be brought down to a local level. I think the local community should be empowered to manage their water. But what needs to happen is they need to be governed in some way, they need to be funded in some way, they need to be steered and educated. I think once that's done, and of course incentivized, once all of that is done, I think there is enough will in the local community to manage their water responsibly and make sure that everyone has clean and safe water.
Would you please join me in thanking an absolutely fantastic panel who I hope have captured all your thoughts from yesterday. Thank you. We will now, of course, break for lunch. So you have 1 hour for lunch, and lunch will be in the room next door.
Listen to you.